Well, good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this, the second day of the We Value Nature 10-Day Challenge. IBAT are hosting this session, and we're very pleased to be joined by the European Investment Bank and Heidelberg Cement. Just as a couple points of housekeeping, as more people are arriving, this session will be recorded and the video will be available through both the We Value Nature channels and on the IBAT website shortly after this event. And we really welcome you to submit any comments and questions in the questions box throughout the session. We'll ensure to leave enough time at the end to discuss those. I hope a lot of you are familiar with the We Value Nature 10-Day Challenge in general. This is a wonderful series of events, and I encourage you to sign up to some of the other really practical interactive sessions. The link on the screen is the way to do so. And you will also receive daily challenges, which are sort of actionable, concrete things you can do to further your nature journey. And they're very quick to complete. So please do sign up for those. And I don't know, I hope lots of you were able to attend the opening plenary, which happened at this time yesterday. It was really good to hear the consistency of opinions from the speakers around the fact that there's been lots of good thought leadership around this topic of nature and biodiversity. But now is the time to take concrete steps towards understanding your impacts and dependencies on nature. And hopefully today we'll present one good option to help companies to understand the environment around them throughout their supply chains, portfolios, and operations. As an introduction to today's session, it's titled Know Your Environment, Applying the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool. I'm Ben Jobson, I'm the IBAT Programme Officer, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Eva Meyerhofer and Dr. Carolyn Jewell. Eva, I'd love you to introduce yourself and your role at the European Investment Bank.
Good morning. I'm Eva Meyerhofer, and I lead the biodiversity agenda, policy agenda at the EIB, also looking at developing the pipeline to increase our investments in the natural capital space, but also engaging with the technical expert group on the EU taxonomy for Objective 6, which is biodiversity and ecosystem restoration. Thank you.
Wonderful, and thank you for joining us today. And Carolyn, please, would you be able to introduce yourself and your role at Heidelberg?
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Carolyn Jewell, and I'm the Senior Biodiversity Manager at Heidelberg Cement. So my role is really to support the company in understanding their interaction with nature, driving forward the strategy around biodiversity, supporting the operations to understand that biodiversity can be a material issue and how to manage that. And also to support the sector as a whole with many business and biodiversity initiatives and sharing best practice.
Superb. Thank you very much both. We'll look forward to hearing your case studies later on. First of all, I'd love to introduce the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool. Hopefully this part will be useful for those of you who are already familiar with the tool, but it will also give a good overview for those of you who are new to the idea and the concept of IBAT. So IBAT itself is the world's most authoritative biodiversity data tool, but it is also an alliance of 4 leading global conservation organizations, which are the United Nations Environment Programme, World Conservation Monitoring Centre, based in Cambridge, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. We've got BirdLife International and Conservation International as well. And together, we provide the most globally authoritative biodiversity data. And that consists of 3 core data sets, which are the World Database on Protected Areas, the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas, and the Iucn Red List. The threatened species in particular are what we provide through IBAT. And IBAT as an alliance is a really key interface between the private sector and biodiversity conservation. So IBAT provides a tool, but it's also a really interesting link between a lot of experts at these organizations. Between the four, there's over sort of 2,500 employees specializing in their respective fields. And then all of those organizations have giant sort of global partnerships between them, which is a really powerful global tool. Now, the IBAT Alliance have come together and they share a common vision, which is that decisions affecting critical biodiversity around the world should be informed by the best and the most up-to-date scientific information and data. And the decision makers using that information should help to support its generation and maintenance. These data sets are quite unique. They're very powerful, they're very resource intensive to maintain. So that's why we ask a subscription fee for our commercial users in particular. Now, the database of protected areas is updated every month in IBAT. It's managed by the Protected Planet team at UNEP WCMC, and it has nearly 260,000 protected areas in it at the moment, and there's good global coverage there. The World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas is a very complementary database to the protected areas, and it represents sites that are internationally important for the preservation of biodiversity because they support sort of congregations of the species that reside there, and those congregations represent an internationally important percentage of all of those species. And we also have the Iucn Red List. So the Red List assesses species and determines their respective levels of endangerment. The Red List contains things like the threats that make species threatened, and also the distributions of those species, so we know where they live around the world. Now, all of these databases will continue to be relevant into the future. We'll always need to know the information that they contain, and they are developing rapidly and improving in their accuracy as well. Some examples of those developments are that with the Iucn Red List, this graph shows a dramatic increase in the number of species that have been assessed over time. We now have nearly 130,000 species being assessed, and there was a target of 160,000 species, and many of those have already been assessed in the pipeline. So you'll be able to see those in IBAT in due course. The same goes for the World Database on Protected Areas. This is developing rapidly as well. Last year we saw over 50,000 new sites added to this database, and that graph depicts the marine protected areas coverage, which is representative of the increase in protected areas globally. So these are really important data sets to understand for research purposes, but for also commercial decision making as well. Now, this is a view of the IBAT platform, and in particular, our data map showing some of the polygons. In this case, it's the protected areas polygons, and they are broken down into their different IUCN management categories. You could also view these as the different types of protected area, Ramsar sites or UNESCO World Heritage sites, and you can view the KBAs, the key biodiversity areas, and their different subsets as well, and a derived data map from the Iucn Red List of threatened species, where we've overlaid all of the distribution maps and created something called a rarity weighted species richness map. And those data are visible through our data map, but they're also you can also interrogate them and look into them at a national level. So one of our really useful resources is the IBAT country profiles. So these are great if you are interested in understanding the biodiversity in the countries where you operate, but also if you're going into new areas, investing in new countries or working in new places, then these can help you to understand the biodiversity landscapes in those locations. And these give you disaggregated statistics from our core databases, and they have come about because the data providers for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals 14 and 15, are BirdLife International, the IUCN, and UNEP WCMC. And the data that they provide is included in these country profiles. So that's things like the Red List index in certain countries, the most important threats to species in certain countries, and the coverage of KBAs and protected areas in the marine and terrestrial realms. As an indication of where IBAT is used, it is a truly global tool, and we have users all around the world. We have a lot of usage in the Western Hemisphere, in emerging markets as well. As you can see from this map, there's plenty of usage in India, Southeast Asia, Latin America. And we've had over 40,000 sites assessed in IBAT. So they're places that users have uploaded onto the tool and interrogated. They can download reports about those locations to identify the biodiversity risk or exposure in those places. And we have over 6,600 users on the platform at the moment. Now, those users come from a vast range of different sectors. We have over 100 different global companies using the tool at any one time. A lot of these companies are leaders in biodiversity management, and some of them have integrated biodiversity across their processes, and IBAT is used by a large number of staff across the world. We've also got companies that operate as environmental and sustainability consultancies, and they also use IBAT for their projects, especially our pay-as-you-go functionality, which they can then use on particular projects. So IBAT supports companies taking their first steps towards understanding biodiversity, as well as those that have already understood it well and have set corporate targets and incorporated biodiversity across their operations. And why do companies want to manage biodiversity? Well, there's plenty of reasons shown on the screen. Some of those drivers include things like national legislation developing in certain countries, such as around perhaps biodiversity offsetting requirements or European no net loss policies, things like the new SFDR regulations and the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. There are also lots of industry approaches, and there's increased recognition for the need of better risk management procedures. Perhaps when environmental impact assessments may not be sufficient or may not be required in a certain country, you'll certainly want to use an IBAT report to add to your analysis. And there's also promotion of methodologies through things like the Cross-Sectoral Biodiversity Initiative, IPCA, or IOGP for the oil and gas industries. And there's performance standards that encourage understanding of biodiversity data, such as Performance Standard 6 from the IFC, which speaks to a number of the IBAT data sets in relation to critical habitat. And there's other more specific performance standards, such as those mentioned by the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. And there's standards agencies that also require reporting against our data, such as SASB, accounting standards, and GRI. Now, by way of some real life examples of why it's important to understand biodiversity, this map shows the global coverage of protected areas in green, but also the locations of wind, photovoltaics, and hydropower. And the dots on the map are locations where those energy sites have been sited within a protected area. So it's quite astonishing that there's been this number of sites sited within protected areas and potentially degrading the biodiversity in those areas. This analysis was conducted in 2019, and it showed that it's not just current operations, but also future planned operations that are being sited in these locations. And that presents a large risk to companies. By way of some real life examples this week, the Spanish BirdLife partner is engaging in a legal case against a wind energy company, which is building a site in a Natura 2000 site and a special protection area. And again, also in South Africa, a wind farm has failed to achieve environmental authorization due to it being surrounded by protected areas and threatened species like black eagle. So that presents a large risk for the power companies themselves, the BirdLife Partnership are really in favour of driving renewable energy forward and that transition from fossil fuels. But we're sort of working to facilitate the safe siting of these energies, and we've identified that there's plenty of space available to be able to site wind energy and solar energy safely through things like sensitivity mapping and strategic environmental assessments, which are the best available approaches for assessing these types of energy. But even in these case studies, just a risk screening in IBAT would have shown that these locations are potentially hazardous ones to avoid. Now, IBAT users are well aware of both biodiversity risk and also opportunities. Risk is probably something that still dominates. The World Economic Forum produces their Global Risks Report. And again, this year, we can see that biodiversity loss is at the forefront of major risks globally, both in terms of impacts and likelihood. And there's a number of different areas where biodiversity risk is relevant. Certainly around reputational issues, in relation to things like wind farms, that might be if you're threatening endangered species. There's legislative issues, fiduciary duty, resource security, and stakeholder relations. A lot of demands on companies to be able to manage that risk appropriately. So interrogation of ESG risk, and in particular biodiversity, can help corporate decision makers to understand unintended consequences of actions, perhaps cumulative impacts across their operations, and any trade-offs that they might need to make, and identify the cost effectiveness of preserving or avoiding biodiversity impacts. So increasingly, it's being expected that businesses are able to demonstrate robust and improved performance in terms of their impacts and understanding around biodiversity. So how do IBAT users identify biodiversity risk? Well, we have a number of different reports to allow them to do so. Some examples on the screen here are our proximity report, which is a basic overlay of our data sets and your project location and a buffer around that location. We also have some more bespoke reports, such as one that speaks to IFC's Performance Standard 6 and the critical habitat that is defined within that. Those are things that we focus on, like critically endangered and endangered species, range restricted species, also the higher levels of protected areas and key biodiversity areas. And we have a freshwater report, which is relevant for operations that are on river systems, and you can identify potential impacts on freshwater species groups, especially those that the Iucn freshwater unit assess, upstream and downstream of a project location, and any potential impacts on things like migratory species that maybe a hydro plant or a operation with some discharge into the river might affect. And companies can also assess their whole portfolios with our multi-site report. And many companies use things like the Red List for assessing which ingredients might be acceptable for sourcing for their products, which areas are chosen for sustainable sourcing of particular commodity crops. And additionally, companies might use IBAT data. This is the underlying spatial files that they can also download for things like addressing supply chains with the biodiversity impact metric, which uses IBAT data, or determining the suitability and risk profile of particular investments. Now, there's the old adage that you can't manage what you don't measure. So there's certainly an opportunity in understanding and being able to monitor corporate biodiversity performance. If you've subscribed to the events through We Value Nature, you'll know that on Monday there's an event that the Iucn is launching, it is hosting, where they are launching these new guidelines, and they will present a 4-step approach to develop a corporate biodiversity strategic plan, and to be able to measure performance across companies' operations and supply chains. So do attend that event, it will certainly be relevant. And there's also a perceived unavailability of data and metrics across the investor space. And I'd like to mention another event later in the series on the 16th of March, where there will be a launch of the Biodiversity Guidance Navigation tool. So that will show you how to find the right tools for the questions that you are asking. So there are tools like IBAT. There are also other relevant tools if you're interested in things like your impacts and dependencies on nature. And in particular, I'm referring to ENCORE in that instance, which stands for Exploring Natural Capital Opportunities, Risks and Exposure. And that's at the sort of sector level, as opposed to IBAT, which is very much at the location level in particular. Now, that previous slide was showing a survey that was done as part of a Credit Suisse report. There was a perceived unavailability of data, but also metrics. Here I'll present a metric that IBAT is currently incorporating and will be launched in the next few months, which is very exciting indeed. It's called the Threat Abatement and Restoration Metric. So STAR focuses on addressing the threats driving species extinction risk around the world. And this metric is very simple to use. It will be initially available through an IBAT report, which is very user-friendly, and this metric is standardized and scalable across the world using this data from the Iucn Red List, and in particular the threats associated with species, to identify opportunities to contribute to species conservation goals, but also where you can undertake restoration activities as well. So this metric will provide a basis for setting corporate science-based targets for nature that also contribute to global conservation goals. On that, I'd love to hand over to Eva at European Investment Bank, and we'd love to hear some real-life case studies of how IBAT has been incorporated into EIB. So over to you, Eva. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Ben. And to follow on actually on Ben's presentation, I'll give you more of a practical application of IBAT, how we have integrated here at the EIB IBAT into our biodiversity risk management system. Next slide. Thank you. So when we decided to look at IBAT, we collaborated with the IBAT colleagues in trying to understand how, if it was possible to integrate EIB's requirements of its standard 3, which is pretty much materially consistent with that of IFC Performance Standard 6, into a bespoke report on IBAT for our colleagues in order to help them and assist them in doing their due diligence. I mean, we are a project financing institution. We do a lot of infrastructure projects, and actually the map that Ben showed you is very telling. I mean, we have targets for climate, and we do a lot of renewable energy projects, and then if you're seeing the European region covered in renewable energy projects, in nature conservation sites, it's actually very important that we also understand the impact of our projects. So what IBAT has allowed the EIB to do is to screen a project's biodiversity sensitivity based on a number of requirements. And this bespoke report, as you see here on the screen, elaborates the features that meet EIB's critical habitat criteria, the protected areas, and it's split in the legally protected areas, and also then other sites that are internationally recognized for their importance on biodiversity. It has included these buffers, which you see also here, 0 to 5 kilometers, 5 to 15, and 15 to 50. And what is very important and is also very useful to our colleagues is that not only does it give, as you see where it says overall biodiversity sensitivity of the site, it will give you a classification of that site and according to critical critical, high, medium, and low. And I'll go into those details a little later. But also, what it does is, according to the different sites that have been spelled out, which you see on the far right side, it will give you an indication of the type of assessment based on our standards that we should be doing. It also gives the advisory requirement on how to treat each of these features according to our requirements. So whether we would need to run a critical habitat assessment, or we would need to have heightened due diligence for a specific site. In addition, now with the new IBAT freshwater report, the colleagues that are working in the energy sector, in the agricultural sector, what it has done is that it has triggered at sectoral level discussions on how to approach integrated freshwater management in a particular country, in a particular location. So depending on the outcomes of that freshwater report, our energy colleagues will then also consult our agricultural colleagues to understand whether they also have any projects in that particular area. And looking at, as Ben mentioned, what is important would be to take more of a strategic view, and we are trying to take that strategic view on certain river basins when we do have a number of projects in that particular river basin. Next slide, please, Ben. So this is, I just wanted to give you a snapshot of our biodiversity risk management tool. You will see this is the screening stage. So on the left-hand side, you have the screening stage. Disregard a little bit all the acronyms, because this is our own internal structures. But what I wanted to highlight here is that you have that classification of critical habitat, high risk, medium risk, and low risk. And on the left-hand side, this is the outcome really of the IBAT, of running IBAT. So when we run IBAT, IBAT will give us this sensitivity, which is the outcome in the report, which you see, which we then integrate with an initial biodiversity risk, which is high, medium, and low, which we derive from the Yale Environmental Performance Index. In that sensitivity, as we mentioned, you have a number of biodiversity features, including and the buffers that have been integrated into our IBAT bespoke report. And one thing that you will have to consider is that we at the EIB trigger critical habitat already for species that are considered vulnerable under the IUCN Red List of species. We also then add a second layer, which is our own layers and categorization system of natural, semi-natural, and urban. And all this has been, these features have been included into IBAT, and then we get this overall sensitivity report. And this allows us then at project level to classify the project's biodiversity risk sensitivity, and to then also inform the type of due diligence that we need to carry out, and also encourage the project promoter to make sure that they are achieving either no net loss or net positive impact, depending on their impacts on the different sensitivities of the biodiversity in the project area of influence. Next slide, please. So this is just an illustration of how that initial biodiversity risk is obtained. So you have on the left-hand side the biodiversity report, and on the right-hand side you have the initial biodiversity risk that we derive from the Environmental Performance Index, also the sector and the country, and the land use change that we in terms of information we get from the promoter, and then the overall biodiversity sensitivity, and then you get this matrix, and that matrix will then inform our biodiversity risk. This will, of course, also within our biodiversity risk management tool determine the resources that we also need to put into the project, whether a biodiversity specialist has to be involved also in the project. And not only that, it will determine the conditions that we will need to put into our finance contract, but also the monitoring and reporting requirements. And most likely there will be a number of indicators associated with the achievement of positive development outcomes in terms of biodiversity that will have to be integrated into the finance contract. Next slide. Now, I just want to also just explain how we use IBAT in our natural capital financing facility, which is a facility that we have established with the European Commission, and it's a risk-sharing instrument to actually develop natural capital financing projects and crowd in private sector for those investments. The challenge that we have in these projects is that most of these projects, of course, because their impacts are more in terms of the positive impacts that they have on biodiversity, you will most likely not require an environmental impact assessment. So we do not have a lot of data. We do not have a lot of baseline data. And so what we do is in those projects, actually for our purposes, is we run IBAT to understand a bit what is the biodiversity value of the sites where you might have restoration activities taking place, or where there will be enhancement or protection of biodiversity measures being put in place as a result of this natural capital project. And so it informs for us some of the biodiversity and ecosystem baselines. It also enables us to identify required conservation and restoration measures. So it gives us a good indication of the level of biodiversity we have there, and then also maybe what are the objectives we want to reach through this particular project. One thing that it also indicates is the parameters that we need in terms of valuing the biodiversity. And what we do is we run an economic appraisal, even for those projects that contribute positively to biodiversity, and is trying to identify the suitable parameters and the values that we will need to include into our economic appraisal. Also for us to better understand the trade-offs and also the positive impacts to society through our economic appraisal. And then finally, it helps us develop a more effective monitoring indicators. Again, because we do not have always the baselines and the accurate baselines, IBAT has been seen as a very useful tool to actually define these monitoring indicators, not only for the natural capital financing facility, but also in our standard projects. So where we can also engage with our clients in defining these monitoring indicators and then allowing them to report on these monitoring indicators to see the trends and evolution on the values of biodiversity that they're impacting on, whether it's negative or positive. That's it from our side, and I'll hand over back to Ben. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eva. That was a fascinating overview of how IBAT contributes to your work on biodiversity, and great to hear about the natural capital financing facility as well. I think it was a little bit before my time, but IBAT developed that bespoke report for EIB, and we're always looking to develop IBATs around the needs of our users. So There's a lot of flexibility around how Ibac can be applied, and this is a great example. I'd love to hand over now to Carolyn, and really looking forward to hearing about how Heidelberg have worked with IBAT and BirdLife to understand the environment around their sites. So over to you, Carolyn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will follow on for Ava with some similarities and a few differences, so a bit varied for you. So yes, I'm going to give a perspective from Heidelberg Cement, who has been a subscriber to IBAT for a fair number of years now. Next slide, please. So if I can just quickly introduce who Heidelberg Cement is, for those that don't know the company. We are the largest vertically integrated building materials producer in the world. We have a really wide geographic spread across most areas apart from South America. Next slide. So yeah, we've got about 54,000 employees working across the world in over about 50 countries. We have a leading market position in aggregates and cement and have over 3,000 production sites, of which over 800 of these are quarries, which of course is the most interesting for us when we're talking about biodiversity and our impact on biodiversity. Next slide, please. So we've recognised for a long time now that our operations can have an impact on the natural environment, both from a negative point of view, but also from a positive point of view. And we really aim to establish a leadership position in the protection and promotion of biodiversities in our quarries. And there are a number of key tools and mechanisms that we use to do this. First and foremost is our global partnership with BirdLife International. We've had this for 10 years. It's our 10-year anniversary this year. And this is really key because we have support at the global level with collaborations and joint position statements. But really importantly is that we get the support on the ground from the local BirdLife partners helping us implement projects. We have sustainability commitments, and I will come into those in a little while. We do a lot of business and biodiversity best practice and knowledge exchange. It's important that we have biodiversity risk assessments at all our quarries to again understand our impacts, whether they be positive or negative. We hold a competition every 3 years where we invite externals into our quarries to undertake projects based on nature, both in terms of education and awareness raising, but also scientific studies. And that really helps us understand exactly what's going on in our quarries. It helps us understand new innovative ways of managing nature, and it also brings us closer to our local communities. We have in-house expertise in advisory material, so we support our operations in understanding their biodiversity on the site. We do a lot on invasive alien species control. We're very aware that the bare habitats that we create through our extraction process can be a paradise for invasive alien species, particularly plants. So we have a process in place to make sure that we understand the species that can colonize and how to manage and control these species. We also have targeted campaigns to raise awareness. So for example, last year was the year of migratory birds, and we did a lot of work with our colleagues on the ground to understand how our quarries can provide both nesting and also foraging opportunities for migratory birds, not only through the migration process, but also for summer breeding grounds. Biodiversity management plans are an important way of the quarry understanding what exactly is in the quarry and what could colonize, and what processes they need to put in place to make sure that they don't impact on this biodiversity. Now, the ones that are ringed, we need help with these. We need tools to help us. And our tool of choice really is IBAT. Next slide, please. So why IBAT? Like I said, we subscribed to IBAT for a number of years. And why is it a tool that's important for us? So at a corporate level, we have our sustainability commitments 2030. And I just want to pick up on a couple of goals that are sit nested within these commitments. The first is that sites within 1 kilometre of a high biodiversity value area must have a biodiversity management plan implemented by 2030. So how do we identify these sites? At global level, we undertake a proximity study in partnership with BirdLife International, and all our sites are run through this proximity to understand which sites are within 1 kilometre. And the databases provided through IBAT assist us with this. This is a really fast-moving area. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but there's a lot of noise at the moment around the post-2020 global framework. We've already seen in the European biodiversity strategy that there's now going to be an increase to 30% protected areas, and this is being echoed also at global level, particularly now with the High Ambition Coalition, led by about 57 countries that are really pushing for this increased 30% protected areas. This could have particular impact on us as an occupier of a large area of land, and so we need to understand exactly how these areas are going to be positioned in relation to our quarries. Also, I spoke earlier about the biodiversity management plans, so we need to create these if they're not already in place, which they are for about 50% of our quarries now. But how do we understand how to develop them? Again, IBAT provides really useful information. It links us through to information on why an area is being designated, and the IUCN species list ranges also help us understand what species could colonize the quarries and therefore need to be considered when developing these biodiversity management plans. Another goal within our commitments is to look at achieving positive impact on biodiversity at relevant extraction sites. Now, many of these sites, particularly the hard rock sites, have been in existence for decades, if not over 100 years. And it's really difficult to understand the baseline, as many of these quarries started before there was ever even a need to really consider the biodiversity on site. And so again, from using the geographical mapping system, we were able to find out a little bit more information about what habitats could have existed in that area, what was likely to be on site, and help us support with the baseline. Next slide. But it's not all at corporate level. There's really an important part for IBAT supporting my local colleagues on the ground. And the way the subscription works is that my colleagues around the world can also take out an account so that they can really dive into IBAT, look at their particular sites and do a rigorous investigation of the biodiversity around their particular extraction site. And BirdLife and the IBAT Alliance really help with support with tailored training. Many of my colleagues have no ecological background, and this is quite new to them, so it's important that we have the support so that they can have the confidence to really use this tool for their needs. It's really important to understand more about the local environment around specific sites, particularly when we're talking about greenfield or quarry extension applications. Both at local and corporate level, we're enabled to go onto IBAT and look to see what's there before we even start thinking about planning applications. Also, we're very keen on partnership projects. This is a really crucial way in which we create a positive impact on biodiversity. And again, IBAT can be used to provide some biodiversity data to inform new partnership projects. For example, we have a project happening in Africa where we're supporting a critically endangered tree species and improving the populations. And again, IBAT was able to directly provide information to support the development of this project. Just to give you an idea of its usage, so the last subscription year we had 97 reports run by colleagues around the world. So this is a really, I think, great way to show how IBAT can be used not only by myself at corporate, but also across the operations as well. Next slide. So another way that IBAT, an exciting way, innovative way that IBAT can support us. So with BirdLife, we kicked off a project a couple of years ago looking at the temporary nature approach that's being used, particularly in Netherlands and in Flanders. And during the operational phase of a quarry, the way that quarries are worked is we can work some areas and move away to work other areas, allowing nature to then colonize the previous areas, which could then be worked in the future. So we have a forever moving temporary nature way around the quarry. But of course, this can provide huge issues, particularly with protected species, because a lot of the protected species, particularly amphibians and a few of the bird species, are really linked with these new pioneer habitats. For example, newts, toads, sand martins, and a lot of cliff nesting birds. So what we've been doing is, with the extractive sector, BirdLife, we've been developing a new code of conduct for how we can manage these protected species in our quarries during the active phase, and come up with a way of developing a derogation that can cover the life of the quarry. And this requires a management plan with appropriate actions to make sure that we're responsible with these species. And we need to know, therefore, in advance what species are likely to colonize. And again, this can be directly informed using IBAT, so not only looking at the protected areas around the site and what species that they support, but also looking at the Iucn Red List species lists as well. Next slide, please. So looking forward, I think we're all really excited about what's happening in terms of biodiversity and policy. It was meant to kick off last year, but of course, everything had to be postponed, or most things. So there really is a question over what this year is going to bring, particularly looking forward to COP15 and the publication of the post-2020 global strategy. But I think what's clear, and what's being highlighted through these events over the next 10 days, is that everybody really needs to work together to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. No matter which walk of life you're from, we all need to work together. And as I mentioned earlier, there's almost a certainty that protected areas will increase. And for a company who is dependent on land, and continued access to mineral, we really need to know what this is going to look like and what it's going to mean. And that's where IBAT is going to become increasingly important. I nearly fell off my chair when Ben told me that there were 50,000 new areas added last year. I think that's been quite a shock to my colleagues. And we really need this tool that's updated so frequently, so that we can continue to understand exactly the interaction between our sites and areas of high biodiversity value going forward. So IBAT really is the tool of choice for Heidelberg Cement, and I would really recommend to other businesses out there, particularly businesses that are large land managers like we are. It really is an important tool, and a necessary tool in the toolbox of how companies interact with biodiversity. So next slide, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was a wonderful presentation. Actually, one of the slides you showed depicted a site in Cambridgeshire that I've been to, and it's the biodiversity around your location that you've helped to nurture is just wonderful, and it's one of the places with the best birds and other biodiversity that I've been to around Cambridgeshire. So that was wonderful. It's great that we've now got 10 minutes for some questions. I've seen some coming through into the chat box, so we'd love to start to address some of those. There was an initial question that I can answer, which is whether we're going to demonstrate how to use the IBAT platform in this session. We won't have time in this session, but I'm always available to offer training sessions and demonstration sessions for companies. So if you're interested, please do get in touch. IBAT is increasingly engaging in lots of novel conversations, new areas of use for IBAT, as well as consolidating the tool's relevance in our historically active areas of companies working in the finance industry, but also the extractive sector. So please do get in touch and have that conversation if you're interested. I'd like to ask a question that's come in that would be relevant forever, which is, how can financial companies who want to have a positive impact on biodiversity use IBAT for their investments? So from my side on that question, we're working with a number of companies that invest around the world. Some of them, like the government pension fund Global in Norway, has huge investments around the world, and they're using IBAT to look at the companies that are sort of falling short and not considering biodiversity, or their locations are in potentially risky areas. So you can start to look at the ESG profiles of companies, and hopefully IBAT in the future will be available and paired with location data of companies, so that financial investors can start to decide if their investments are going to be sustainable or not. But Eva, I'd love your opinion on how can financials use this data to understand what they're investing in and the types of asset classes that they're investing in.
It's a difficult one because, I mean, we have used IBAT primarily for projects, right? So investments, and we haven't been using IBAT to run, let's say, looking at intermediated financing, right? Where we don't know yet the pipeline, and that makes it a lot more complicated. But I think you're right. It's just one of the elements that you would be using in terms of the impact of the corporate at a specific location, but also in terms of its value chain. If you already have a good idea of what that value chain is, and I think the country report is very useful in that sense. The IBAT country report, and it's that amount of data that you then need to aggregate with other data, such as the double materiality and looking at ESG scores, and you feed into then an overall score. And I think what will certainly allow financial institutions, as they want to understand the impact of certain asset classes or their investments, is once you start integrating the STAR metric. Because without that metric, it makes it a lot more difficult for financial institutions to actually understand the biodiversity impact of their investments. And I think this will be really an added value to IBAT. Otherwise, it's very location specific, and it's an extremely useful tool, as Carolyn mentioned, at project and site level, to manage the biodiversity at site level.
Absolutely. So for many of the companies using IBAT, historically, it's been most relevant for real assets, to name a particular asset class, and those types of assets where you have direct knowledge of the infrastructure and the location where you're investing. And hopefully in the future, IBAT will become more relevant for other types of asset classes. And the STAR metric, as Eva mentioned, is relevant here. To answer another question in the box, the STAR metric is something that will be able to help you if you are working on projects that are primarily focused on habitat restoration and regenerative activities. So that is going to be relevant there. But historically, IBAT hasn't been something that would have been used so much for planning things like offsetting and so on. A question for Carolyn is about a particular site in Mombasa called Haller Park, a rewilding of a quarry. I hope you're familiar with this one. The question is whether this is a model that can be applied to your sites in general, and if yes, how many sites have been restored in that nature?
So when when the after use of a quarry is being decided, there are a number of factors that are taken into account. So the community have a huge say and a huge input into what happens. So, and also the spatial zoning of the local authorities. So there's a real mix of what a site will go back to. So, for example, if the site is situated on the edge of an urban conurbation and there's requirement for an increase in industrial or residential by the local authority, then of course we're pushed in that direction. However, there's some really exciting options also for nature. I'm really excited by all the work that's coming up around landscape scale conservation and understanding these networks and how the quarries can actually contribute to the connectivity of habitats through the landscape. We've got some really great flagship sites across the world. So, for example, in Western Australia on the outskirts of Perth, it's a KBA area where we started before the KBA was designated. And there we're restoring Banksia woodland, which is a very rare type of woodland, which is probably almost one of the most species-rich habitat types going. So we've got an exciting project that's been going on for 25 years where we've been working with universities to make sure that we understand exactly how to recreate and restore this habitat. I showed the picture earlier, and Ben mentioned this exciting wetland. It's going to be the largest man-made wetland in Europe, just outside Cambridge. The driving force behind that was the fact that the European bittern had really declined in the UK to only 10 booming males. And with the BirdLife partner, we set about this project to develop this huge reed bed, which of course supports, I think now over 10 booming males alone, as well as lots of other species. So yeah, there's huge opportunities also to connect quarries in the landscape. So river gravel beds, you often get a number of operators working along the gravel beds, and an exciting opportunity is to then align the reclamation plans so that they all support wetland habitats, which of course also provides flood alleviation services as well as biodiversity.
Wonderful, thank you. To answer a couple questions about the IBAT's access, the costs are listed on the IBAT website under our subscriptions page, and that's the same for the pay-as-you-go as well, that those prices are listed there, and the access to IBATs increases with your subscription level and with the size of the pay-as-you-go transaction. And all of that revenue goes straight back into updating and maintaining these data sets, as I mentioned earlier. On the water that you were mentioning before, Carolyn, there was a question about whether IBAT will include other data around things like deforestation risk or water-related risks. At the moment, that's not data that the IBAT Alliance has generated ourselves, and it's more external. We're always looking to develop IBAT and to see how it can be most useful, but at this stage, we don't incorporate our own water data aside from the freshwater risk screening tool, which is recommended by certain water tools. But I was wondering, Carolyn, how you deal with water risk at Heidelberg.
Yep, so water is another considerable consideration within Heidelberg Cement, and we have particular sustainability commitments looking at water as well. But currently we use the water scarcity tools. I can't off the top of my head remember the name of the tool, as this is dealt with by another colleague, but there's existing information that we use, and actually for the water, a lot of the information is downloadable, and we've integrated it into our own GIS systems. But of course, a one-stop shop is always preferable. So if there is interest in putting that into IBAT as well, I'm sure we would use it as well.
Wonderful, thank you. I noticed we've come up to the end of the session. We're at the hour mark, unfortunately. There are plenty more questions that I'd love to get into, and I will try and respond individually to those or direct them to whoever's most relevant after the session. Please do get in contact if you'd like to continue the conversation. There's a link on the screen for the Capitals community, and you can log on there and engage in discussion about this and a lot of other events in the series. Please do send your feedback about this session through to this link on the screen. You'll also be sent the link afterwards. And thank you so much everyone for joining. Thank you very much to Eva and Carolyn for your presentations. It's been wonderful to hear this case studies, and I hope the session has been useful.